My name is Amy Willis, and I'm the Director of EconLib websites for Liberty Fund, the host of our conversation today. We're really grateful that you took some time both to read Arnold's review of Peter Zeihan's book and to join us for conversation. We're really happy to be joined by our friend Michael Gibson today, who will chat about the book with Arnold, and as usual, we'll open it up to conversation from all of you shortly. While we're in the conversation session and you're thinking of your questions, participants, you may feel free to use the Q&A function to submit questions, or you can simply raise your hand once we open it up to questions, and I'll return to allow folks into the conversation as we go. We'll run for about an hour, and we are recording our conversation so that we can make it available later for those who couldn't join us today. So thanks again to all of you for joining us, and special thanks, as always, to Arnold and to Michael for joining us for this conversation today on Peter Zeihan's book. Arnold, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Amy. And thanks, Mike, for joining us. I'll give the briefest introduction of Michael, and he's welcome to add to it. He, first of all, he's a recent author of Paper Belt on Fire, which we've talked about. And he also is his main job is a venture capitalist, the 1517 Fund, which really tries to find young entrepreneurs and get them started and makes money doing that. So the book we're going to talk about is by Peter Zeihan, and he's all over YouTube, so a lot of you are probably familiar with him. His view of the world, I think, can be described this way. He thinks that since World War II, the world trading system has been pretty much whatever the United States wanted it to be, because the United States had the naval power to sort of make the rules. And right between World War II and the fall of the Soviet Union, the trading system the United States wanted was something where everyone who was in part of the anti-communist coalition got to play and everyone else didn't. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, because we were dependent on foreign oil and we enjoyed cheap labor from China, we kind of opened up the world trading system to everybody. And we had what Zeihan calls the order of, sort of free trade under the US umbrella. But since the US discovered fracking and became energy independent, and since China started to move up the ladder in terms of what they could produce and so on, and we started to be concerned about China, we've sort of walked away from the order, is his view, that especially because we could be energy independent, we lost interest in enforcing the order. And so what he's predicted in this End of the World is Just the Beginning is that the US will back away from its role of ensuring safety on the seas and safety in general for world trade. And in some sense, chaos will result. And he forecast several conflicts, one of which broke out just about the time the book was going to press, and that was the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So anyway, that's his view, and then he traces out implications, like if countries are no longer going to, if we're no longer going to have a really well integrated trading system, then, and countries are going to be on their own, then he looks at how each country will fare based on being on their own. So Michael, you have any other generalities about the book?
I thought that was, yeah, that's a great summary. I think, I guess he's probably most controversial on those predictions where, on the one hand, this receding influence of the United States abroad, giving up our role as the global policeman. That's, I think, something we could dig into. And then the second one is probably his forecast of the collapse of China, the disintegration of the CCP. And then maybe, less controversial, but still part of the book is this almost involuntary autarky that he assumes will be imposed on all these different regions and countries based on the withdrawal of US influence. So, how independent all these different countries become in that world is also up for debate. But I think the biggest controversial claim is probably that the one about China.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
the one. So let's just. I was going to get into that early, so let's get into that. He has this view that a country is really, especially in a world where trade drops off, and we can argue. I think I would argue that maybe trade isn't dropping off as much as he thinks it will, but in that world, you depend on what he thinks are key resources. One of them is a working age population. And he was very big on demographics and showing demographic charts and showing how badly off some countries are in terms of the ratio of elderly to working age people. So if elderly people consume way more than they produce, and working age people produce more than they consume. And if you have a bad ratio there, you're in trouble. And several countries would be in trouble on that score, like South Korea, Japan, Russia, China. His second issue on resources is being able to produce your own food and produce your own energy. So on all those three things, even the demographics, the United States is in great shape. We can produce our own energy, we can produce our own food, and we don't have a ridiculously high ratio of elderly to middle-aged workers. China is in bad shape in all of those, he would argue, but he thinks that the collapse of China is imminent. And that's an extreme view. It's all, maybe if you're in his business, you take some extreme views, and if you're right, you're a hero, and if you're wrong, you hope everyone forgets it. But what would be your critique of his view that the collapse of China is imminent? Because their demographics have just turned to where their population is starting to decline, but their ratio of elderly to middle-aged workers is still high. And they do depend on imports for food and energy. Is that enough to suggest that they're going to collapse by the end of the year, which is, I think, would be his prediction?
You're right. He does place an aggressive timetable on that. And maybe to your point about the business he's in, I guess, if we go back to the old distinction, Philip Tetlock's distinction between foxes and hedgehogs, maybe Zeihan is more of the hedgehog when it comes to his faith in the United States, and then his doubts about China, because in his previous book, it's like the same themes are rehearsed as well, and maybe the one hedgehog idea I think he's motivated by is this geographical determinism, and then maybe the demographic piece. So he almost seems to believe that geography is destiny. In his recounts of history, he places a lot of emphasis on things like whether or not it's, a nation is an island nation or a peninsula nation, navigable rivers, these kinds of things. And so in my view, I think my own understanding of history is more within the institutional framework, that rules and ideas and institutions matter. when it comes to progress, whether that's science and technology or just broadly economic growth. And so when you read Zeihan, he greatly discounts how comparative institutional analysis between nations and why that may have led to, let's say, the Industrial Revolution or different growth rates and so on. And so when I think about the example, China's collapse, and then maybe the US, be maintaining its place as a prosperous country, I wonder if because he's not thinking in terms of politics and institutions, maybe he's underweighting things. So on the US side, I would say maybe he's underrating perhaps the negative influence of woke politics, polarization, institutional failure. He seems to think that we can just coast on our, generous,
our navigable rivers.
Yeah, right. And then on the Chinese side, now I can't speak to, it's like there's a great debate about whether China is on the precipice of a sovereign debt crisis of one sort or another, whether that's because they've lent out so money to the developing world and now those loans are defaulting. I guess they have issues on the corporate debt side. And then on the sovereign debt side, it's their balance sheet is mysterious, but it could be the case that they're not in a great financial position. But maybe when it comes to the demographic piece, again, I would say institutions, rules, and cultures matter. And if you look at the most technologically creative societies, they're not always the most numerous or populous, right? I mean, it matters, where you are in this world. If you look over history, it's like, who was the most advanced at the time, dependent upon what rules and institutions they lived under. So it could be the case that China, even though they have this demographic crunch coming, they have such a large population. So you get this demographic pyramid inversion where, the bottom used to be young, now it's top heavy and fewer young people. But maybe they're still so numerous in China, and there is enough in place to ensure that they make the technological and scientific advances to maintain their growth, or at least to deal with some of these issues that he brings up when it comes to what he calls, I think the phrase I like is grumpification, like the number of elderly people in a society. I mean, maybe, more robotic labor, maybe certain types of health extensions so that retirement age is raised. These sorts of things could happen, but yeah, I'm not going to pretend I know if China's going to collapse or not, but I just think he seems way too pessimistic.
Yeah, I think he tends to believe in what we used to call in economics L-shaped isoquants, which is a fancy term basically saying you can't substitute for anything. So if today you need this much land and this much fertilizer to grow crops, then you're going to need that ratio forever. And if you fall short on one, then that's going to end it. And what that means is you tend to overpredict the effect of a shock. So he was one of the people who thought that the Ukraine war was going to cause, the collapse of Europe's ability to manufacture, a gigantic food crisis, double-digit inflation, just, all this stuff. But substitution exists. Prices affect people's behavior. The L-shaped isoquant can't respond to prices, but in the real world, when prices change, people come up with new production techniques. They conserve on some resources and use others. And I think that's an issue there. And I think it's an issue with demographics. If you demographics, it's a slow-moving process, and there's plenty of time for prices to adjust and incentives to make things happen, like you mentioned, substituting capital for labor and so on. I mean, South Korea hasn't collapsed, even though it's much farther along on the demographic decline than China is. So you mentioned institutions and ideas, and I agree with that. I mean, I think economists have come to see an increasing importance of ideas and institutions, and they've kind of lowered the weight that they would put on the things that he's, resource availability that he has. What are would you say, are the strengths and weaknesses of China's institutions? I know you're not a China expert, but what strikes you as their strengths and weaknesses right now?
Well, I do think up until, I can't remember the exact year, but they had set up a fairly dynamic economy where entrepreneurs were free to start and grow businesses, and some of them grew to exceptional size. But maybe the symbolic case is the internet entrepreneur Jack Ma, who at some point questioned President Xi. This was prior to an IPO, and then Xi, disappeared Jack Ma for some period of time. I don't know where he was sent, but when he came out, he did not look like he was the same person. So maybe it involves some kind of communist indoctrination. I don't know. So it seems like, China had done a good job in some of its market-oriented reforms going back 30, 40 years. But in the last 2 or 3 years, they've certainly put a chill on that. So if I'm an entrepreneur in China now, I don't know, I guess maybe you have to stay because you can't leave, or maybe it's just the only place you can operate. But I wonder if people are looking for exits. And then there's also other things too, like China has been, encouraging or maybe even ordering a lot of its companies to withdraw from foreign stock exchanges to reshore to China. So I think they had a good thing going. It's not clear that how with these added, or I should say these. It's almost like the state is just asserting its power. And I'm enough of a libertarian to wonder, if I think about the origins of wealth and the dynamism of the West, things like the rule of law, property rights, contract. Not regime uncertainty in the sense that the government could expropriate your company or nationalize it or even send you off to prison. My forecast on China is less about their demographics at this point and more a concern that maybe they're just turning more and more into the Soviet Union and therefore will become less dynamic.
And how would you evaluate the United States these days? Was there a peak years ago in our kind of institutional freedom? And
so I think that's part of it too. Is I wonder, one of the things about the book that I think needs more development is the motivations for the end of the order. I mean, Zeihan just sort of says that we're going to lose interest in asserting the order, and it's like I don't see much evidence of that. Like the Ukraine example is a little bit on his side in the sense of maybe Putin and his friends were thinking in those terms that the United States wasn't interested in maintaining its role as global policeman. But on the other hand, it could be argued that the war was started because of the assertion of the order. So Russia strategically has always wanted to keep Ukraine out of NATO. They see the threat of NATO expansion as something that they're very sensitive to. And then that port in Crimea has always been a very strategic piece for them. And the fact that Ukraine was, since 2007 has wanted to join NATO, that puts that port in a very precarious position. So in a sense, it's almost like the United States is maintaining the order, and Russia wanted to fight against that. So I don't see a lot of evidence Taiwan is another case study, I think, where they have the largest semiconductor company in the world, TSMC. There's some supply chain vulnerability there. And so maybe a good test of Zeihan's thesis would be, it seems to be the case, like even before this current year, that the United States has been worried about that supply chain vulnerability. And, you know, you look at companies like NVIDIA, they're the makers of the GPUs that are used in deep learning and machine learning and even Bitcoin mining. They moved a good chunk of their operations to Samsung in South Korea out of Taiwan. Their efforts, God, we passed that. I mean, a lot of it's pork, but, you know, the US passed that bill, the CHIPS bill, to provide incentives to build in the US. But independently of that, it's like Intel and even TSMC have announced that they're building things in Arizona. So as those production facilities come online, and then, you know, maybe the strategic interest in Taiwan decreases, that would be a good test for, will the US defend Taiwan even if we don't need their semiconductors anymore, or at least not to the same degree. So those are some thoughts on that. But back to the earlier question, I think was like, yeah, I worry that I don't think that our geographic bounty is enough to ensure our continued prosperity. I think we suffer from our own debt issues and government dysfunction. I think it is, you know, if you look at, and then all the way down to the micro level of the way our cities are managed, you know, innovation is driven by creative clusters. And it seems to be the case that on a micro level, our government is doing its best job to destroy those creative clusters. I lived in San Francisco for 10 years. This was supposed to be the next digital Athens or, you know, the next Renaissance. And I saw the city destroyed in 10 years due to bad policy, everything from zoning to policing to managing the homeless and drug addiction population on the streets. So, you know, I think the race between America and China will be decided by some of the things Zeihan lists, but I also worry about some of these micro foundations as well.
Yeah.
One more thing I'll add is like, one thing he could have developed, but he didn't, is that a motivation for the end of the order could just be our own disorder.
Yeah.
We don't have the money to spend $1 trillion every year as global policemen. Our defense budget is quite extraordinary. And then also maybe the woke side of it too. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's like our general staff is more concerned about LGBTQ stuff than it is about the national defense in some ways. So, you know, how competent is our military still? That's another weird thing in the book, I think, is like Zeihan is asserting that the American power is receding from the world, and yet he's always he's constantly reminding us how powerful our Navy is compared to the rest of the world. But I question, I mean, maybe our Navy isn't powerful at all, and one punch to the chin, you know, China could launch a hypersonic missile and destroy a carrier. Would that send us, would that be the event that leads to the receding order?
Yeah. Yeah. Back to the Ukraine war, I think, you know, he years ago predicted the year it would break out. I think he got lucky on that. But, you know, again, you make enough forecasts and you hope that all the super precise forecasts that were wrong are forgotten, and the ones that are right, you never let people forget. But you know, he thought of, you know, in terms of like, you know, an old, you know, a mid-20th century situation in which if Ukraine is not in the Soviet orbit, then, you know, the tanks could roll across Ukraine into Russia. Maybe Putin thought that way too. I don't know, but it just seems a strange way to forecast it. But then once the war broke out, I think a lot of things would have surprised him. First of all, was how strong the European response was and how strong the US response was in kind of buttressing Europe. I mean, that suggests that the US still cares about the order. And I think that may be true, rightly or wrongly. I think the foreign policy establishment it's like the proverbial aircraft carrier in a river or something, so, very slow to turn around.
Yeah.
And, maybe they're still back in the, in the 20th century thinking about, the US has to be in charge. I think there's a lot of element of that in both
Right.
political
I think,
parties.
and that's bipartisan too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty rare to meet anti-war left or right at this point.
Yeah. Well, they're all in the fringes. But
I think one thing he did get right, especially with COVID, and then somewhat with Ukraine, is just that the order does create these intricate, complicated, widespread supply chains. And, everything from, shortages of toilet paper to diapers. I guess there's a shortage of Adderall right now. And so maybe, supply chain insecurity is becoming more of an issue. To his point on shipping, what was it? It was like the Suez Canal blockage. There was a container ship that went, I guess the wind pushed it. I'm not quite sure what happened.
It went aground somehow.
Yeah, it went aground, and that stopped trade through the Mediterranean for a week.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of the other point I'd make against him, is that I think he overestimates the speed at which the trading will decline. I mean, all things considered, the volume of trade now is pretty high. I mean, considering, all the attempts at decoupling, at throwing sanctions at people and so on, the trade is doesn't look like it's collapsing. The volumes are high. And I think I saw somebody say that the volumes are even higher than they were like pre-COVID. So I think he maybe underestimates the propensity to truck and barter, as Adam Smith put it, so on.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the idea of the supply chain fragility. I think there are those headline news, but like you're saying, is like it you can't turn on a dime. Anecdotally, I know a lot of people who source everything from construction to tech, who they source parts from China still. And maybe there's talk of relocating to a different country that has lower, the same, let's say, profile in terms of labor costs and so on. But the idea that we're going to reshore everything back to the United States and reindustrialize and do it in a short period of time, that seems like wishful thinking and just not possible.
Yeah, I don't think that'll happen. So one more thing before we let the audience ask their good questions is, what's the outlook in the VC industry in the United States these days? Is as a source of dynamism, is that still a big asset? And is it are there things that are holding it back that maybe weren't holding it back a few years ago?
I think the biggest shift in the last year in the venture capital industry is everyone suddenly realizing that they have to understand macroeconomics. I mean, everyone has been used to operating in a low interest rate, zero interest rate environment where money is just abundant. That I don't think many fund managers really thought that they had to pay attention to inflation and what the Federal Reserve might or might not do. But in the last year, definite regime shift where the amount of capital being deployed is much less than it used to be. The amount invested on any investment is less than it used to be. And the valuations. So we've seen just a reset in these really frothy valuations of the last few years. And you can see it in the valuations of public markets, especially tech companies. They've all seen price compression to a strong degree. I mean, even Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. But then if you look at the growth tech public companies, they've been decimated, 70, up to 85% loss in market cap. And so that has shifted into the private market. So valuations are coming down. Maybe both companies and investors are becoming more disciplined about it. We've seen these layoffs in tech. It seems like more and more are announced every day. Maybe that ties into the book, and something I think Zeihan underestimates is it's interesting to see how fewer and fewer people are capable of doing more and more. So maybe these tech companies were, if you look at Twitter, it looks like Elon Musk fired 5,000 out of 7,000 people. And for all I can tell, the company still looks like it's operating. So maybe there are efficiency gains that'll become more and more apparent as there are layoffs. But on the capital side, the last point I'll say is like, it is still very much a global industry. So, I mean, I think the United States is still the hottest game in town as the most dynamic place, whether it's in biotech, space, internet, whatever. But the capital from around the world is still, being deployed from everywhere. In that sense, it feels very much globalized.
So this is off topic, but it's kind of the topic du jour among many people, the large language models and AI, chat, GPT, and all that. Is that, I mean, some people, China has been supposedly pushing on that, and they're supposedly about to release their version, what they say is their version of chat GPT. And is there a lot of sloshing around right now of funds that would have been deployed in other parts of the venture world into this, or is it just something that you're gonna have to sit back and watch the big guys like Google and Microsoft play, and are startups going to be in that space?
I think a couple thoughts on this. One, to the geopolitical side of things, there was a book that came out a few years ago called AI Superpowers. I think Kai-Fu Lee, right? And he's spent some time in the United States, but Beijing-based VC, and his claim was that China was in a better position to win the race to build artificial intelligence because in China they're less squeamish about harvesting data from their citizens. And then his point was that you could feed this into the models that they need to train on large data sets to detect statistical correlations, subtle correlations, and so on. And so therefore they were in a position to win this arms race. And I think what Chat GPT shows, and my intuition about that was that he was off, is that okay, we are a little squeamish about harvesting data from health records and so on, but the United States has access to all of the internet, and that is more than enough data to train certain things on, like something like Chat GPT has shown that it's using, I don't know all of its data sources, but it's pretty clear it's just drawing on what's available on the internet already. And as its models become, or the algorithms just get better and better, you need less data to train on. So it's interesting to see. I'm not quite sure his thesis is holding.
And what about, so the little guy versus the big guy?
So then the next thing I'll say is what is being commodified is the actual algorithms, meaning as complex as they are and mysterious in a way, the deep learning and machine learning, it's very easy to get to the cutting edge on that. What becomes valuable then is the data that those algorithms train on. And so I think where startups are going to have success is when they have access to a proprietary set of data that they can train these algorithms on. What that means is something like we have a company that does speech recognition and transcription. So you might think that Google or Apple with Siri, Amazon with Alexa, that they have very strong speech recognition systems because they have the ability to train on all the data they collect from people's phones or devices. And that's true as far as conversation goes. But we have this company that focuses on professions with specialized jargon. So think doctors, lawyers. And so the average speech recognition algorithm isn't picking up on that jargon and won't know what it is. And so this company specializes in harvesting data from, let's say, the way doctors talk in their offices or when they transcribe their notes and all that. So as an example, it's like, okay, if you have a siloed set of data that you can train on, and that's your moat, that's your competitive advantage, then I think, as a startup, you'll have success with the Chat GPT style stuff.
All right, we're overdue. I'm sure that the audience is champing at the bit. So Amy, do you want to bring them in?
We do have some folks who are chomping, so I'm going to let Laura into the conversation here first. Laura, when you unmute yourself, you are free to go. And then after Laura, I'm going to allow Salvador in for a question about demographics and monetary inflation. Laura, are you ready?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome.
This is my first time. I didn't know you guys let us talk, so that's cool. Thank you. Really interesting discussion. Thank you so much. And my initial question had to do with population decline. And I put that in just before you all really started talking about it. So I don't have anything more to say. You really addressed it. So thank you.
Well, I did think of something we didn't mention. Arnold asked me about ways in which China's governance or institutions might be in a better position than the US. And it could be on this demographic. Again, they're not very squeamish about experimenting in biotech or in forcing people to do things and turning on a dime. So, I mean, on the light side, maybe they're quicker to implement some kind of incentive system for families. But in some dystopian sense, maybe they would also be the first to have some kind of like baby farm or who knows what, I mean, it's like they are very different when it comes to, if you look at their COVID response in good ways and bad ways, it's pretty clear that that they do try to turn that ship fast.
Thanks. And thanks, Laura. I don't see Salvador in the chat room anymore. So Salvador, if you're still there, pop back in. In the meantime, Andrea, I've let you in, so please go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. You guys are talking about generally not believing Zeihan's claim about the collapse of global trade. I'm there. Specifically, one of the things that didn't make sense to me was his trust that global trade is completely vulnerable to piracy. And I'm curious what you guys think about that. Do you think that piracy would actually be a huge problem? Do you think that if the US gave up on suppressing piracy, that nobody else would step in there?
I think the book should have had the subtitle Revenge of Jack Sparrow. The Return of Jack Sparrow. Arnold, do you want to jump in there?
Well, I think, we're the only country that can project all around the world with our Navy. And I think it's hard for me to picture the kind of the lone buccaneer, the guy with the eye patch, doing, succeeding. But what could happen, and I think what Zeihan is thinking would happen, is that some countries would, in effect, become, pirate countries that just, set up in effect toll booths on the oceans and saying, unless you comply with this and pay us that, we're not going to let your ships through. So I think I could see something happening on those lines.
Yeah, but then you're running into as a stationary bandit rather than a like movable bandit. And and then you start moving into a privateer model. Yeah. And then at what point does privateering simply become protection, like enforcing protection in this area?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There, I guess one of the weird things about Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand is maybe her writing's bad, but she seems to be very prescient. And so, she forecasts the end of Detroit, that it would turn into a dystopian wasteland. And one of the odd things about her book is she forecasts the return of piracy, because there's like this character who starts seizing ships that are, transport ships sending gold bars. So maybe we should read Atlas Shrugged and see if there are other things that might be true in there. But yeah, I think Arnold's right. Like it's hard to, but I just don't see, unless the United States runs out of money, I don't see us giving up on protecting the high seas anytime soon. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. And maybe it becomes cheaper and cheaper to do it too. I mean, maybe this is where drones come in, and maybe the deployment of special forces rather than whole navies. It's not clear to me that that's on the wane anytime soon.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Andrea. Kevin Corcoran, you're up.
Yes, hello. I haven't read the book, but I was struck by the comment about how the author is of the opinion that over time the United States is going to lose interest in its historical position as basically world's policeman, and will kind of become more withdrawn and inward focused. There is a pretty vocal strain of thought within libertarian and classical liberals who would hear that and say to themselves, good, because there's a belief that the United States' attempt to be the world policeman has been pernicious and led to a lot of instability and has caused a lot of damage. Does he speak to the people of that opinion and basically, say anything to the effect of, when you get what you're asking for, you're gonna miss the good old days of what it was like when the U.S. did do this, because it actually kept things stable in a way that you don't appreciate? Or does he think that the interventions the United States has been involved in did cause disorder to the degree that's usually alleged? Or does that not come up at all? And if not, do you have any thoughts of your own about that?
Yeah, I think that is, you've characterized the libertarian view of, just sort of, you call this policing the world order, and look what you've done, in Libya and places like that. That just, you could have a whole debate about, whether having a superpower that's in a position to act unilaterally is a good thing or a bad thing. Taking into account that some of the things that they'll do are bad. There's actually a book by Finley and O'Rourke that argues that trade has always expanded under a hegemon, and that gosh, I don't know why I'm blanking on the title, but somebody will find it. Anyway, so that's one view, and I think that's probably the view that Zeihan holds, is that if you don't have a hegemon, you have anarchy, and if you have war of all against all, you don't have much in the way of trade or development. But that's certainly a view that could be controversial. You have the opposite view expressed in a recent book, and I don't have the author's name at the top of my brain, but saying that sort of Europe's success and development came from the fact that there wasn't a single country in charge, and so you had sort of competition between countries to get development. So that's just a huge argument. But I think Zeihan is implicitly on the side of those who believe that you get more trade if there's somebody kind of in charge.
Yeah, I know Joel Moyker touches on that fragmentation of Europe as an explanation for the rise of science and competition on technology and even the Industrial Revolution. But there was a book by a historian of Rome who said the fall of Rome led to the fragmentation of Europe, and that's what led to Europe's ascendancy. I can't remember the name either. Yeah. But if I'm going to say something really controversial on this call, I think my one contrarian take on history would be, maybe it would have been better if we weren't in NATO at all after the Second World War. And here's my theory, is that without protection, Europe would have had to have learned to defend itself. And if it didn't, then maybe the Soviet Union would have conquered Germany and some of France. And the reason I say, okay, well, they would have learned their lesson. If you look at Eastern Europe, they're much more friendly to free markets and America now. And if I think of the history of ideas over the last 50 years, I think the rise of postmodernism came from Europe, this questioning of the nature of truth and its value, which then transformed into all the critical race theory and everything in the United States. So they became toxic idea exporters. And I don't see that from Eastern Europe. It's only from places like Paris. Anti-Americanism started in Europe, under our aegis, of the order, bad teenagers. These people wanted to rebel against us with their anti-Americanism. And now all of that is coming back to haunt us in the form of wokeism and so on. So maybe my controversial take is maybe we shouldn't have had the order in Europe and we should have let them fight for themselves.
I think that John Elkhorn's question follows on that pretty well. John, go ahead.
Yes, my question is about the order and military conflict. And my question is, might the Ukraine conflict be a kind of exception? Because that conflict combines public choice and democracy in just the right way. The military-industrial complex, major interest group in Western countries, wants war in the sense of more justification for producing materiel. But populism, democracy, doesn't want to supplement the treasure with the blood, doesn't want boots on the ground, risk of own citizen casualties. And the Ukraine conflict is the ideal type of war for the military-industrial complex, given the populist constraint about boots on the ground, because Ukrainians are willing to spill blood. So I guess, is the Ukraine conflict a sort of perfect storm that enables the NATO and US to form a grand bloc, but it's not something that can really carry over to other global situations? That's my question.
So we will be the world's policeman as long as we're hiding behind someone else. That seems like that seems sort of plausible. And I guess the question is, what situations where we can't hide behind someone else?
Well, does it often arise that there's,
I think your political economy is spot on in describing the failures of American foreign policy over the last 40 years. So if you look at Iraq, Libya, Syria, you name it, Afghanistan, in each case, it seems to be what you described, where, okay, for some reason of American interests, our military goes out and destroys things. But then when it comes to having the patience and resources to conduct nation building, our democracy is not interested in that. Maybe we are set up to attack, defend, and destroy, but not build anything, yet we're drawn into it.
Darren, Eddie, I have you in here next. Go ahead, please.
Has to unmute.
Yeah, Darren, you need to unmute yourself, please.
Yep, classic. It sounds like one way you can think of Zeihan's work as sort of a end of history, go back in time, become poorer, less specialization. One thing that's changed obviously a lot throughout his period since the beginning of, I think he calls it Bretton Woods, is nuclear bombs. If you were to take his whole thesis as somewhat credible, the assumptions and the logic, do you think that changes things still fundamentally, even if he is right on most of his thesis?
You're talking about the nuclear proliferation maybe changing his thesis or affecting it?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is something to consider, because if you have this, less order and less deference to the United States, then probably the odds of someone setting off a bomb go way up.
I thought it was interesting that he places so much emphasis on the power of the Navy, but didn't once mention, that we live in the atomic age. And, maybe the reason for the order was also just the nuclear deterrent.
Yeah, and it's just not clear how much, military technology is changing. You mentioned hypersonic missiles and so on. And, it may, we'll have to, it may be that, having better sort of artificial intelligence based small arms is more important than the big stuff. I mean, maybe that's a little bit one of the lessons of how the Ukraine situation is going.
Yep.
Thanks. Xavier, I have you in next.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to make just a comment, a short comment, no more than a question, and it's about the policing of the seas, about the idea that the United States will do less policing of the seas, will have a less, I guess, projection of power, or as you want to call it. And I don't see any evidence for that, first of all. And second, I think a few other countries are actually trying to do more policing themselves, which contradicts, I guess, what the thesis of Zeihan. I'm thinking mostly of these new military bases in Djibouti, which is actually close to Somalia, which is where a lot of sea piracy seems to be based. That I think actually contradicts what Zeihan is saying, and probably means more countries are actually interested in maintaining sea lanes, actually working on maintaining security in sea lanes, and that not affecting actually supply chains and all of that.
Yeah, I think that is really a fragile part of Zion's thesis, that we will go from the U.S. losing interest in policing the world to a world in which you can't ship safely from Saudi Arabia to China, which he really thinks will happen. That's, I think there are a lot of people who would have an interest in making sure that you could make those shipments. And I think you're right there.
Maybe a weaker claim he could have supported more was just that the cost of transportation will go up, or the cost of goods will go up, and that will hurt countries, but not be catastrophic. We'll have supply chain delays and so on, and there'll be fewer things, but it's not going to be catastrophic. It'll just, be a lowering of the standard of living in some ways, but not I think his word is decivilization.
That's Zion's claim. That seems extreme.
Thanks. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. I have John, and then anyone else who would like a final question, please either raise your hand or shoot me a message in the Q&A. Thanks. Go ahead, John.
A question about the striking and, to me, puzzling current role of the United Kingdom in the order. On the one hand, the UK has opted for Brexit. That's a kind of decoupling. On the other hand, the UK is currently perhaps the greatest hawk for being the world's policeman. How do you make sense of this mix?
It doesn't sound like either of us is ready to make sense of it.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, Europe is so strange. Like the Germans are in a strange position where they want to defend NATO, but on the other hand, they have their trade and business interests that are all wrapped up in Russia and China. But the UK, you're right, seems the most hawkish on this. I don't know. I mean, if my first cut would be to say it's the vestiges of the British Empire and the old NATO system, but maybe that's not good enough.
Thanks. Kevin, go ahead, please.
Yes. One other question has just come to mind.
Oh, hold on. That was my fault. Sorry,
Okay,
Kevin.
can we hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. One question that comes to mind that actually follows off the Brexit point. One of the author's ideas was about how the US could, at least in principle, achieve energy and food independence, say. And supposing that he's right about that, it would still come at a pretty significant economic cost to produce all energy and all food in-house, so to speak, rather than as part of the international trade system. And you would expect standard of living to take a hit as a result of that. And when citizens' economic well-being take a hit, they don't always respond to it very well. One of the biggest predictors of an incumbent party losing an election, say, is economic hardship among the people. But at the same time, this is where Brexit comes in, a lot of the people who are proponents of Brexit recognize that that would be the case, that their country might be economically worse off, but still considered that a worthwhile trade to be made. I think probably the most concise, pat description of that was a British person saying, I would rather be poor and British than rich and European. So does he think that there's an element of that in play as well, that maybe there's a sort of populist desire within the United States that would make people want to do this, even if it would lower their standard of living? Or does he think that's something that people would be blindsided by, or does it just not come up at all?
I think that what Brexit illustrates is how difficult it is for populists to overcome elites. Because what the people thought they were voting for in Brexit was an end to immigration, large-scale immigration. That's the one thing that the government just consistently refused to give them. And the net result is that the Tories are, have fallen in their popularity at record rates. It's like the public has just said, okay, you're not going to give us what we want at all. We're going to punish you and hope that labor does better. So the question is, is there something similar going on in the United States, where maybe the public, couldn't care less about Ukraine, but the elites have said, we've got, this is something we've got to do, and the public is just going to be frozen out of that, just as the public was kind of frozen out on the immigration issue in the UK. It's just, so I think it's hard to predict what the effect of the public will be if elites on some issues are just so dug in that they're just not going to respond.
The one thing I'll add, I think there was something you said, Kevin, or I think it was Kevin, but that the arrow of causation in Zeihan goes from the order to security to peace to prosperity. And I think he could have seen this more as a feedback loop, or even that the causation went the other way, that the prosperity created the peace and ensured the existence of the order. In which case, as long as the economy is growing and so on, and maybe that's the West, maybe it's the US, then the order will be established and extended.
Well, thanks everyone. That takes us to the end of our hour together.